My name is Bob Newton. I'm the interim director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, and I'm also the special assistant to Father Leahy. I asked one of you out in the corridor, did you know who Father Leahy was? And she said, Father Leahy? He's the president. I know you all know him. So. Well, welcome to the third event in the fall program for the Church in the 21st Century. Our theme this year is grace and commitment, and explicated by saying it focuses on the vocations of the laity, of the ordained, and of religious. Before John Kelly, whom I will introduce briefly, introduces our presenter, I would like to say three things. If you haven't received a copy of C21 resources, you'll find I encourage you to pick one up. This is the current edition called The Vocations of the Laity. And right in the center, you'll find all of the programs that the Church in the 21st Century sponsors and co-sponsors. So there may be some other things that would be of interest to you. The other thing I want to suggest is that you bookmark the Church in the 21st Century website. It's intuitive. It's just www.bc.edu, and then it's /church21. So you don't have to write it down, you can remember it. And you'll find all sorts of interesting things on that website. For example, Father Leahy, you'll find Father Leahy on the website telling his story about how he grew up on a farm in Iowa, how he went to a one-room schoolhouse for his early education, how he became a Jesuit, eventually ended up at Boston College, and what he thinks he's doing here as president of Boston College. And if you don't want to listen to Father Leahy, you could find Mark Herzlich, who many of you know suffered from devastating cancer last year as one of our premier football players, and talks about what it meant to him to go through this ordeal and yet at the same time become a quasi-famous person. And if that doesn't interest you, in 2 weeks, on October 14th, you can watch the video-streamed presentation tonight of John Neafsey, because we're committed, practically all of our events, to 2 weeks after the event, putting it up on our website. So anyway, you can all remember that website. It's just the BC website /church21, and you'll find all sorts of interesting things there. Let me now, I don't want to go on because we want to get to our speaker, but let me introduce John Kelly, who's sitting next to John Neafsey over there. John is a BC junior from Atlanta. He's majoring in accounting and theology. It may seem like a strange combination, but if any of you have been following the news from Rome about the troubles of the Vatican Bank, John may graduate just in time to help them solve those problems. John he's the student representative on the Church in the 21st Century Advisory Committee, and he has for several years been on our Student Advisory Council. He's an active member of the Appalachia Volunteer Program. So let me stop now and ask John to come up to introduce our guest speaker tonight.
Okay, well, again, thank you everyone for coming out this afternoon. I'd like to begin with a quote from John Neafsey. For some time, I've had the sense that an important dimension of my own calling is to help other people discover theirs. These words define the man, his work, and his commitment to his vocational journey. John Neafsey is a practicing clinical psychologist and senior lecturer in the Department of Theology at Loyola University, Chicago. He recently took a position as a staff psychologist at the Marjorie Kovler Center for the Treatment of Survivors of Torture in Chicago. In his popular book, A Sacred Voice is Calling, Personal Vocation and Social Conscience, John Neafsey examines the relationship between personal calling and social conscience. He teaches us how to distinguish between the authentic voice of our true calling and all of the other distracting, competing, counterfeit voices in ourselves and in our culture. Those can be the voices that tend to get us on the wrong track. John also shares a sacred family vocation and lives with his wife and 2 children in Chicago. Mr. Neafsey, on behalf of the students, staff, and faculty, we welcome you to Boston College.
Thank you very much, John. And it's nice to be here with all of you at BC. I've never been here before. I've been to Boston a few times, but got a little tour of the campus today, and it's a wonderful place. My topic is the heart's calling, personal vocation, and social conscience. In a certain sense, I'm going to be telling you a little bit about this book that I wrote, the subtitle of which is Personal Vocation and Social Conscience. So it's kind of the book in a nutshell. I think I'm going to try to talk for maybe 35 minutes or so we can leave 20 minutes or so for discussion, some question and answers. I think the idea is to finish in the neighborhood of 6:30 with the formal part of things, and then so that if people have to go off and study or go off to other things, that's fine. And I'd be happy, though, if afterwards to talk informally and stay around for a bit if anybody would like to do that, okay? So I'm going to say a few things about this complex matter of what it means to find and follow a personal calling or a vocation. And I especially want to highlight the connection between personal calling and social conscience or social responsibility. This thing that Frederick Buechner put so beautifully, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. I'm especially interested in the role of social conscience in callings to compassionate service, peacemaking, and responsible global citizenship. I guess particularly in recent years, especially since the 9/11 tragedy and the onset of the Iraq War, I've found myself increasingly preoccupied, I think both personally and professionally, with the moral and social and political dimensions of vocation. I think there's a way that vocation can be seen as the call of conscience or as a call to conscience. And in the book, I try to expand the notion of vocation to include this sense of social responsibility or civic engagement that we're all called to, each of us and all of us. And in the book, I explore some particularly challenging and troubling issues of conscience and calling in relation to global poverty and privilege, the so-called war on terror that we're still very much caught up in, the drastic erosion of respect for human rights in our country, particularly since the 9/11 attacks, and a number of other controversial and contentious crises of our time. Much of that's beyond the scope of what we can get into tonight, but I'll try to touch briefly on a few of these things by way of example as I go along. And although I stand personally in the Roman Catholic tradition, I operate practically from a more ecumenical interfaith understanding of vocation. In a nutshell, I operate on the assumption that the intuition of a sacred purpose for our lives is a universal or archetypal human phenomenon. And I might say that basically that means that it's possible for each of us and all of us to detect and align ourselves with a sacred purpose for our life, however we name that. So in other words, everybody has a vocation, including Catholics and Protestants, Christians and non-Christians, religious people and non-religious people. those who use God talk and those who don't. For many people, referring to God by whatever name is the only way to adequately express the profound sense of depth and sacredness that they experience in relation to their life's work. Other people, though, who are less comfortable with or familiar with religious language for various reasons, prefer to describe their callings in non-religious terms. But I think ultimately the words we use to talk about it are less important than the integrity and heart with which each of us pursues our callings. There's this beautiful poem called The Summer Day by Mary Oliver, the poet, and in it she puts the big question at the heart of it all. She says, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" So much depends upon our answer to that question. So much is at stake in this matter of what we do with our lives, how we choose to use our precious time and talents and energy during our short lives here on this earth. Certainly our personal happiness is at stake in important personal decisions that we make that could have a dramatic impact, for better or for worse, on the future well-being and quality not only of our own life, but on the lives of our families and loved ones. But there's also a way that the future well-being of our world is at stake in choices we make that could potentially make a big difference, for better or for worse, in the lives of people in our local or national or global communities. Just think, for example, of how the generous vocational choices of a doctor like Paul Farmer to make an option for the poor have made such a profound life-saving difference in the lives of destitute, sick people in places like Haiti or Rwanda. I think on a deeper level, it sometimes feels as if our very souls are at stake when we're wrestling with decisions about what we're called to do in important matters of love or work or conscience. They are. And I mean that not only in the sense that decisions we make during our earthly lifetime will affect our prospects for salvation in the world to come, but more in terms of the precious opportunity we're given to save our integrity and humanity in this life by discovering who we are, what we really want, what we have to offer this world, where we stand on important issues of our time. Maybe most importantly, how we can help to make some small difference for the better in this world while we have the chance, while we're alive. And that always begins, of course, with care and attention to the needs of our loved ones and those in the personal circle of our everyday lives. But I think as we consider our social responsibilities within the widening circles of our local and national and global communities, our callings and our social responsibilities extend beyond our personal circle to an ever-expanding network of connection and solidarity with people all over the world, near and far. And I think especially with those in our world who are most vulnerable and at risk, the poor, the oppressed, the nobodies, the kind of people that Jesus referred to as the least and the last. So as someone who works both as a clinical psychologist and as a college theology teacher, I have an interdisciplinary interest in both the psychology and the spirituality of vocational self-discovery. And I think especially in the ways that these come together in the heart dimension of our human experience. I'm particularly interested in the affective or feeling dimensions of vocation, because vocation is very much a matter of the heart. Callings come to us, first of all, by way of the heart. We hear them by listening to our hearts or with our hearts. And I think the people and the things that move our hearts to passion or compassion are especially important to attend to in vocational discernment. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So I think in both my teaching and my clinical work, I'm often in this privileged position of helping people learn to listen to their own hearts for clues to life directions that seem to hold the promise or potential of greater meaning, healing, wholeness. And I think paying very, very careful attention to the deeper movements and inclinations of our hearts is one of the primary tools that we have for discerning our callings, for hearing the inner voice that calls us to our unique destiny as persons. And I think that is very much consistent with the core insight of St. Ignatius Loyola, who was one of the masters of discernment in the Christian tradition, who in the 16th century had the simple but very psychologically sophisticated insight that thoughtful consideration of the interior movements of our own hearts and souls can help us to discern God's will for our lives, can help us know what God wants us to do with our lives. Ignatius saw our hearts as a kind of an inner compass that can help us to find our way. But again, discernment is not just a private, interior, individual matter. It's not just about what we want or what we need, but about what the world needs from us. And so there's this ethical dimension to vocation, a way that our conscience speaks to us through a kind of moral tug upon our heart that pulls or draws us one way or another. There's this wonderful Irish theologian, Enda McDonough, who talks about the moral tug upon the heart. But basically, it's this tug that pulls us to be this kind of person versus that kind of person, to do this thing versus that thing as we make our way through the world. And that's, in a certain sense, how our conscience operates. I suppose the moral challenge in all this is to find a discerning balance between a kind of a contemplative inner listening within ourselves for calls and a more outward, socially engaged listening beyond ourselves, between listening to our hearts and listening with our hearts for the ways that the needs and the sufferings of the world are calling out to us for intelligent, compassionate attention. Does that make sense? Okay. It's a wonderful quote from a Spanish Jesuit named Jose Garcia, who wrote that what matters most is that the world should touch the heart and that the heart should go out towards the world. So let me just say a couple other things about vocation, then I'm going to touch on a few different aspects of it. The original Latin roots of the word vocation center around this metaphor of hearing and following a call or a voice. And there's different ways for us to understand exactly who or what is doing the calling. From a spiritual or faith perspective, of course, God is the caller. Persons of faith name the one who is the author of the call, the one who's doing the calling, as God. That beautiful metaphor from the scriptures, the still small voice of the Spirit, this voice that mysteriously speaks both beyond and within ourselves, helps to guide us on our way and calls us to do the things that we're meant to do with our lives to become the persons that we are meant to be. There's a beautiful passage on the inner voice from Thomas Kelly, a Quaker writer, and he describes this inner voice just beautifully. He says, "Deep within us all, there's an amazing inner sanctuary of the soul, a holy place, a divine center, a speaking voice, to which we may continuously return. Eternity is at our hearts, pressing upon our time-torn lives, warming us with intimations of an astounding destiny, calling us home unto itself. That's from this lovely little book called The Testament of Devotion. So here we're talking about the inner voice of the Spirit, huh? And we can think of time-honored spiritual practices like prayer and meditation as forms of inward listening for the inner voice, as ways of improving our listening skills so that we can develop ears to hear it, ears to hear this voice that speaks within us and also speaks to us through the people and events and experiences of our lives. That's speaking all the time, if we would only stop and listen and notice it. From a psychological perspective, there's other ways to conceptualize or imagine who or what this voice is. Many psychologists talk about this sense of vocation as resembling something like the voice of our deepest and most authentic inner self, our true self, our best self, something that speaks within us through the deeper and truer inclinations and desires of our own hearts. In the words of Father Michael Himes from Boston College, who I found to be a great resource on these kinds of things, he says, "The secret of vocation is to discover what it is that you most truly and deeply want when you are most really and truly you." So that deep sense of kind of authenticity characterizes vocation. I think it's also possible to see vocation as something like the inner voice of conscience. There's this sort of ethical dimension to this inner voice. I think although there's not a clearly articulated concept of conscience in the Bible, something resembling conscience can be seen in the biblical notion of the heart, this beautiful metaphor we see throughout the Scriptures. "I will put my law within them," said the prophet Jeremiah, "and I will write it on their hearts." Or the psalmist who wrote, "You desire truth in the inward being. Therefore, teach me wisdom in my secret heart." And so there's different ways to think of this voice that calls us. I think that God can use all of these different manifestations of the voice to help us, to get to us, to guide us. And when it comes down to it, all of us need all of the help that we can get in these matters, God uses the deeper inclinations and desires of our true self, the promptings of conscience within us, the wisdom of our secret heart, to help and guide and call us in matters big and small, day to day, over the course of our life, toward the sacred purpose for which each of us was created. And it all begins, though, with listening. The voice is speaking all the time, but we have to be able to hear it. We have to be able to pause enough to be able to tune into it, to hear what it's saying, to see if we can decipher it. I always show my students this clip from The Field of Dreams, where Kevin Costner hears the voice speaking in the cornfield, and it sort of begins rather cryptically, "If you build it, he will come." And he gets very confused by this. He thinks he's a little bit crazy. But eventually, after a long process, he begins to figure out exactly what it is that he is supposed to build and who the he is who is going to come if he builds it. I won't spoil the movie for you if you've not seen it. The problem, though, is that when we pause to listen, we inevitably seem to hear all kinds of voices clamoring for our attention, pushing and pulling us in all sorts of different and often contradictory directions. And so the challenge, I think, is to learn to discern or tell the difference between the authentic voice of our true calling and all the other competing, counterfeit noise in ourselves and in our world and in our culture that distracts us, that gets us on the wrong track, that gets us into detours and dead ends. Between the still small voice of the Spirit and all the distracting racket in our heads and in the world that drowns it out. In Frederick Buechner's words, we must learn to distinguish between the voice of our own deep gladness and what he calls the great, blaring, boring, banal voice of mass culture. How's that for a mouthful? James Joyce, the wonderful Irish writer, wrote of the difference between what he referred to as the call of life to our soul and the dull, gross voice of the world of duties and despair. Has anybody ever heard that? You never heard the dull, gross voice of the world of duties and despair? I hear it all the time. Few other comments on vocation. I think although finding meaningful work that matches our God-given interests and talents is a very important dimension of vocational discernment, we should be very careful not to define vocation too narrowly or exclusively in terms of work or career alone. There's more to life than work, and vocation is much bigger and richer than what we do from 9 to 5. I think this is especially important for us Americans to remember because of the excessive emphasis in our culture on things like productivity, achievement, upward mobility, all of these kinds of things that are not bad in themselves, but if we get too caught up in them, they can be hazardous to our emotional and spiritual and moral health. We do well to remember the saying, even if you win the rat race, you're still a rat. So, vocation is also not only about what we do. We get so caught up in our culture with doing. It's also about being. It's about who we are, the quality of our personhood, the integrity and authenticity of our lives. It's about the kind of persons that we're called to become, regardless of what we do for a living. I also think the sense of vocation can potentially encompass every level and dimension of our lives, our professional life and our personal life, our family life, our love life, our creative pursuits, our politics. Basically, anything that we do can be infused with a sense of calling. I think it's also possible to experience different callings at different times of our lives, or to experience multiple callings at any particular time of our life. And sometimes we're kind of in a process of sort of attempting to do justice to various callings all at the same time. The call to parenthood, the call to be creative in our work, the call to all of these various things. There's sometimes it's a difficult, challenging thing to be trying to answer callings in various areas of our lives simultaneously. Let me give you a personal example. And it's about how it's possible for us to experience callings in relation to any or all of the multiple roles that we find ourselves in at any given time. Student, friend, colleague, spouse, parent, son or daughter, parishioner, neighbor, citizen, etc. These callings in different areas of our lives, I think, are also interrelated in complex, mysterious ways, and this is a kind of an example of that from my own life. The experience of falling in love, I think, is often accompanied by a profound sense of vocation. This was my experience when I met and fell in love with Mara, the woman who was to become my wife. Both of us, as it turns out, wanted to have children, which we interpreted as a kind of mutual calling to share the joys and responsibilities of parenthood together. But as it turned out, our particular path as a couple to parenthood was through a kind of labyrinthian process of international adoption, which is itself a kind of a calling. We eventually adopted 2 wonderful children from Guatemala in Central America. And as we've come to know and love our little son and daughter, we've also come to know and love their homeland in ways that we never could have imagined. So it's as if the journey to parenthood opened us up to this whole other world south of the border, So the heart connection to our kids has opened us up to the heartbreak and desperation and traumatic history of their own beautiful country, including the dark history of our own country's intervention in Central America over many decades. And so as privileged North Americans who tend to take our own way of life for granted, this experience has been a real wake-up call, speaking of the metaphor of calling, for us. And we find ourselves in a kind of ongoing process of discerning our own social responsibilities to the poor, and especially to our Latin American neighbors to the south. In the book, I refer to wake-up calls as these experiences that kind of shake us up, wake us up, shock us out of our moral complacency and indifference and numbness, with the realization that things are much worse for most people in the world than we've ever allowed ourselves to admit. John Sobrino, the Jesuit theologian from El Salvador, calls this awakening from the sleep of inhumanity. And I think there's a way that privileged people may be called to take on an even greater burden of social responsibility because of their privilege or because of our privilege. There's a saying of Jesus that has become very unsettling for us and has kind of haunted us. Much will be asked of those to whom much has been given. So, among other things, very practically speaking, all of this prompted me to begin to volunteer my services as a psychologist about 10 years ago at the Marjorie Kovler Center, a Chicago program that serves survivors of torture from Central America and various other trouble spots around the world. And this in turn led to my recently taking a staff position at the Kovler Center. The work at the Kovler Center, in turn, has heightened my own sense of personal grief and shame and anger over the last several years in response to the torture scandals with this whole issue that began with Abu Ghraib, but the scandal of what apparently has been very widespread systematic torture of prisoners in the custody of U.S. military and intelligence services, places like Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Abu Ghraib in Iraq, Bagram Air Force Base prison in Afghanistan. So there's a way, in a certain sense, that this has heightened my own call to sort of speak out or do something in response to this crisis in terms of the erosion of human rights and respect for human rights in our own country. I've been a part of this group that withheld our dues from the American Psychological Association over the past 4 or 5 years because of the APA's complicity in allowing and sort of giving its blessing to psychologists who participate in coercive interrogations with prisoners at these unlawful facilities like at Guantanamo Bay. So that's a lot of territory I just covered right there, beginning with falling in love, this joyful experience, and ending on a rather dark note, But the point is not, in all of it, is not the particulars of my life story, but that for all of us in these matters of the heart, one calling often seems to lead to another. Everybody's journey is different. And often the best we can do is to be as open and receptive as we can to calls when they come to us, and then always be ready to be surprised by the next one when it comes along. You just never know where they're going to lead, or what will be next. So I'm going to end with just a couple thoughts on social conscience, which is at the center of the book. And again, the capacity for social conscience it sort of requires this simultaneous inward listening to our heart as well as listening with our hearts to the troubles and needs of the world, And I think more precisely it has to do with listening for the ways that God is speaking to us or calling to us through the cries of the poor and the oppressed, the neglected, the forgotten, the least, and the last of our world. John Sobrino, again the Salvadoran theologian, says we need to learn to hear the word of reality. And by reality, he means particularly the reality of social suffering, especially the painful reality of people who are suffering needlessly in unjust poverty or because of unjust war. And I think one of the most important ways that we hear the cry of the poor and the oppressed is through our heart's response to their pain and their need. Sobrino says the natural response of the human heart to injustice and inhumanity always consists of some combination of compassion and indignation. Compassion is a particular kind of passion we experience when we're touched or moved by other people's suffering. The Latin root of the word compassion is to suffer with. It's as if we sort of vicariously or empathically experience some of their pain by sort of imagining or feeling ourselves into their world. We feel for the sufferers or with the sufferers. Our heart goes out to them. And that heart response is always accompanied by inclinations towards action, to do something to relieve the pain in some way. There's a call, I think, contained in those inclinations towards action. And I think compassion is often also accompanied by a sense of indignation, and I think this is where the liberation theologians are really good at this uncomfortable thing that many of us tend to kind of avoid. But indignation is a kind of a holy anger or outrage that people should even have to suffer needlessly in such situations in the first place. And I think with indignation comes an inclination to do justice, to do something to change or remove the unjust social conditions or policies or ideologies that are causing the hurt or the deprivation in the first place. So I think callings to service and callings to justice often originate in these kinds of stirrings of our hearts, stirrings of compassion, stirrings of indignation. And on a deeper spiritual level, I think that there's a way that such feelings that we experience can put us in touch with the heart of God, can help us know something of God's own grief, heartache, heartbreak over how badly things are going for so many of God's children in this world. I think we hear echoes of God's own pain and anguish in the biblical prophets, who I think were not primarily angry social critics, but rather often seem to be rather grief-stricken, heartbroken people. People like Jeremiah, the prophet. There's a beautiful passage from him that I'm just going to read. Jeremiah says, "For the hurt of my poor people I am hurt. I mourn. Dismay has taken hold of me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of my poor people not been restored? Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people." For the hurt of my poor people I am hurt, he says. And I think if we were to think of vocation or how to frame the vocational question from the perspective of a prophet like Jeremiah, it might center around identifying the people in our world for whom we hurt. That might be a way to get clues about where we're called or who we are called to serve. And I think we tune into such feelings not just for the sake of getting depressed or overwhelmed by the world's problems, which is pretty easy to do sometimes, but more with the aim of opening ourselves up to hear the word of reality so that we can discern what we're called to do about it. And I think discerning what we're called to do or which particular social responsibilities or issues we're called to take on always begins with this kind of attention to the stirrings of our hearts. What's stirring? Where are we drawn? To whom are we drawn? What's really getting to us? And I think such feelings can be understood as the emotional echoes of the inner voice of conscience resonating in our minds, in our hearts. And I think in times like these, our consciences should be uneasy. Our hearts should be troubled. And that's a good sign, because such feelings are indicators that our consciences are in working order, that we have a heart, that we're human. As the Reverend William Sloane Coffin once said, the quickest way to lose your humanity is to begin to tolerate the intolerable. And maybe I'll just finish by saying in this global situation of expanding inequity and injustice everywhere we look, and as citizens of a nation that's caught up in two wars that are regarded as unwise and unjust by most of the world, it may be that an uneasy conscience is the best place to listen for the whisper of the Spirit that calls us to a better way. Thank you.